Welcome to video number 2 in 215 Advanced Behavior Management and Programming. In this particular video, we're going to take a look very quickly at behavioral approaches, and we'll really quickly describe them. But at this point, we've already covered them in other modules, and you should have an understanding of these well enough to be able to move forward. If after this video you still don't feel clear, I'll expect you to reach out to me for help on this. And we'll also take a look at some other non-behavioral approaches that should be pretty commonplace for you by now, but we'll want to make sure that we include them in whatever we do moving forward. So the most basic behavioral approach, probably the most famous, is called reinforcement. Reinforcement means to strengthen. Whether I'm strengthening a bridge or strengthening my muscles or strengthening a behavior, it's called reinforcement. And it means the same thing. Many people think that reinforcement is the same as reward, but it's not really a perfect comparison. Rewarding does strengthen some behavior, but sometimes we use other types of reinforcement that aren't rewards per se. Positive reinforcement is called positive because it's R plus, reinforcement that involves addition. We add something to a person's life after they've done a behavior, and the thing we add is something they want. It's a desired outcome to a behavior because it gives the person something they want. For example, giving a child candy after he cleans his room. The candy is a positive reinforcer. You've added candy with the aim of strengthening the room cleaning behavior. But there's another type of reinforcement, and it's also very powerful. Many people do not understand it well, and you may even read textbooks that confuse it with punishment. It's not the same as punishment. That's negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is another type of desired outcome of a behavior, but it's not a reward in the classic sense because something is getting taken away that we don't want. It's negative, meaning something is subtracted. Something that we don't want being taken away can be good news. For example, if you take your garbage out and somebody comes and removes it, they are giving you what you want, a desired outcome. Less stinky garbage is going to strengthen the behavior of taking the garbage out. When you study, you're probably looking for some negative reinforcement, such as reducing the feelings of stress that come from not being prepared for a test, or going to bed early so that you don't feel groggy in the morning. That absence of grogginess isn't something added in your life, it's subtracting an unpleasant thing. And that's really important. So don't be confused by the idea that reinforcement is always reward. It is sometimes reward, positive reinforcements, and sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to define because it's the removal of something unwanted, and therefore it's desirable. The opposite of reinforcement is called consequation. When a behavior has an outcome we don't want, we think of it as consequation. So there are two types of consequences that we use in this field: logical consequences and natural consequences. We don't like to use them, we don't always use them, but we can use them if it seems like it's necessary. A natural consequence is put in place by, you guessed it, nature. The laws of nature take over. If a person plays with matches, nature might cause them to have a burnt hand. If a person puts a cat in a bathtub, the cat might scratch them. That's just nature. If a person jumps off of a building, they might get a broken leg. Gravity is part of nature. But the problem with natural consequences, even though we can use them sometimes, is that they have a couple of issues. Not every person that lights a match gets burnt. Not every person that gives a cat a bath gets scratched. And not everybody who jumps from a high height gets a broken leg. So sometimes people do things for a long period of time and think they're getting away with it. They're not getting the consequences. And so natural consequences are not always reliable. But there's another problem. Sometimes the person who burns their hand doesn't just burn their hand, they burn their whole house down. The cat doesn't just scratch their hand, but now causes a major infection. Or the person doesn't just break their leg, they break their back. And so sometimes natural consequences are too harsh for us to apply. They have too much risk. So be careful about natural consequences. Logical consequences tend to be a little bit safer because we have some role in implementing them. But what's important to understand is that the role we have in implementing them has to be connected to reason or logic. It has to be that the consequence makes sense in view of the problem behavior. For example, if you break my window, logical consequences could include things like cleaning up the mess, repairing the window, or paying for the repair of the window. It might even include not being allowed to do the activity in the same area of the window, again, whatever it was that broke it. But logical consequences are typically predictable or at least explainable to people. So you and I might have different logical consequences, but chances are there's going to be a lot of people who would use the same one as us. So you watch out for the idea of what we call arbitrariness. Sometimes a consequence looks the same to other people, but it isn't always logical. Here's an example of that. A child is out in the schoolyard screaming and yelling. The teacher says to the child, "You'll have to stay after school," and have a detention. Another child doesn't do their homework. They're up out of their seat and they're walking around. Sorry, not their homework, their schoolwork. And they're walking around. The teacher says to them, "You'll have to stay after school." In the first instance, the child is getting punished. There's no connection between screaming and yelling and staying after school, at least not based on the information we have right now. But in the second scenario, with a tiny bit more information, it could be a logical consequence. So instead of telling the child they have to stay after school, you tell them they have to stay after school until they complete the work that they missed. Now it's a logical consequence. So to the outside world, you might think these things look pretty much the same, but they aren't. The idea of consequation is to deter or decrease the behavior we don't want. So it's weakening. It's the opposite of reinforcement. Some of the other behavioral tools we might use include systematic desensitization, or sometimes referred to as exposure therapy. In this technique, we basically expose the person to something that causes them fear or anxiety in a very gradual and controlled way. And it's lovely to combine this tool with other techniques like biofeedback, classical conditioning, which we'll get to in a second, positive reinforcement for the person trying things, and even talk therapies that help them to look at why they're anxious. So a lot of tools can be used. But basically, it's about gradually exposing the person in tiny increments to the thing they're afraid of, and every time they get a little bit more comfortable, we increase the increment. Classical conditioning is the tool that was first put in place by Ivan Pavlov. In Ivan Pavlov's famous experiment, he got a dog to salivate by giving the dog food. And he realized he didn't really create that reaction. The dog had naturally become conditioned to that. In other words, essentially the dog had learned it. He didn't use the word learn because learn suggests that the dog was conscious of it. So instead he created this word called conditioned, which is basically the dog became habituated to it. So the dog drooled because the dog knew that food was coming and salivation was the natural response to that. So Pavlov thought he would try ringing a bell for the dog. And of course, when he rang the bell for the dog didn't salivate because the bell meant nothing to the dog. But what Pavlov did was classical conditioning. He created this idea. So every time he was about to serve the dog food, he rang the bell. Now, over time, the dog began to salivate. Of course, the dog was salivating from the food originally, but now, after a while, Pavlov could take the food away and just ring the bell, and the dog would salivate from the bell. The bell became the new conditioned stimulus, not instead of the food, but in addition to the food. Now remember, the key idea here is that Pavlov was working on an animal that he did not believe, we still don't believe, possesses conscious thought. This is a pretty powerful tool then, because we don't need to use it on people who have a lot of cognitive ability. It can be done on children and babies. It can be done on people with intellectual disabilities. It really taps into something that is instinctive for people and other organisms. We create patterns based on things. And that's what classical conditioning is. So we can use classical conditioning especially for helping reduce fear and anxiety as well. How do we do that? Well, for example, if a person's really comfortable and happy in the bathtub, we might put something in that bathtub or in that bathroom while they're bathing and gradually have them become conditioned to it, like a particular piece of music that's playing on a radio. And then, if we know they're going into a situation where they normally feel anxiety, we might bring that radio into that same scenario, and the person will start to experience some of the same physiological cues, just like the dog's salivation, that they would have felt in the calm environment, even though they're in the high stress environment. So you can do that at the same time or in addition to the exposure therapy I mentioned before. What if I want to teach somebody a new skill? Well, we use two tools there called shaping and successive approximation. Successive approximation, the name kind of says what it is. Successive means in a series or in a row. Approximation, if I'm approximating something, I'm getting closer to what it's supposed to be, a facsimile of something. So I'm getting gradually closer and closer to doing the final end product. And all that we're saying, this is actually an abbreviation for something which says positive reinforcement of successive approximations. That's a fancy way then of simply saying we give people rewards for making small steps of progress. Every little bit of progress gets rewarded. Shaping is very similar. And for the sake of this module, I'll keep it simple and simply say that we make it easy for a person to learn in chunks. We'll learn much more about this in another module later on life skills training. And you may be able to think of other behavioral approaches that we've considered in the class before, and some of them are reactive and some of them are proactive, and it'd be interesting to see you journal them or blog them. I'll give you a hint. One of them is called the Premack principle. But there are a number of other non-behavioral approaches that we've been learning to use. And we don't necessarily think of them as being in a big pile or bundle, but we should. We're going to add more to these bundles by the time this module is over. So another set of approaches that we might use is the medical and physical interventions. These are not behavioral because they don't rely on psychology. They don't rely on the idea of rewards or conditioning. They include things like giving people medications or treating their underlying health conditions, whether they're mental health conditions or physical health conditions. Something like diabetes or chronic pain can absolutely affect a person's behavior. So if we treat those conditions, their behavior will likely improve. Medical therapies of all kinds, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, chiropractic are all examples of that. Even dentistry can fit into this category. Imagine a person who's nonverbal and has bad teeth. That's very likely to lead to them showing their feelings, their sensations, through physical behaviors. Counseling therapies are typically not necessarily thought of as being in the medical domain, but that's where I would put some of them, especially those that are done by psychiatrists, because psychiatrists are doctors. Sleep, anything you're doing to adjust a person's sleep routine, whether it's giving them more or less, or establishing a better sleeping environment for them by having a better mattress, or giving them white noise, or adjusting temperature. Giving people naps sometimes are all examples. People's dietary adjustments fit in this category. What to eat, when to eat, foods to avoid are all examples. Exercise regimens, very important, including cardio, strength building, balance adjusting, and core strength. Lots of different things we can do for people. Surgery, a variety of different kinds of surgery, and we don't do it, but we might support people to get to surgery. For example, I've had to help people who are very afraid to go in the hospital, and so we used exposure therapy to help that person get to the point where surgery could happen. And of course, their post-operative care will be part of our work as well. And helping people with adaptive equipment, like wheelchairs and crutches, all fits in this. You may be able to think of other medical and physical approaches, and I would encourage you to do that. There are many more. Finally, for this video, non-behavioral approaches can also include tools in the training and education domain. Those might include things that you kind of purchase off the shelf or go to another provider for, like going to a local school program or college program, or watching a course online, or buying a package of DVDs or computer programs that are downloadable that help people to learn skills. Examples where this is possible are things like socio-sexual skills. By getting materials like this, you kind of make it easier for staff to deliver the content in a way that you know is going to be careful and approvable, and not putting the staff in an uncomfortable position as well. That's just one example. Life skills training can also be taught that way, and so can social and coping skills be taught using some of these materials. And of course, literacy skills like how to manage money, how to read, how to write, are all part of that same stuff. Media, whether it's games, DVDs, computer programs, television programs, iTunes University courses, lots and lots of different things exist. And something as simple as giving a person an educational game can make a big difference for them. Often we combine the media, something like a cookbook, with a training program that we define. So the idea, again, in all of these is to be comprehensive. So we don't just pick from this column or from the column about physical and health or from the column about behavioral. We pick from all of them, and sometimes we're picking multiple items from one column. So we want to bring all of those to bear. You've learned about task analysis, some of you not so much, but a task analysis is simply the work of breaking down something like a life skills task into its steps and teaching the steps bit by bit. When we do chaining, we're taking task analysis a step further. Instead of teaching the person in a series, we only teach them one step at a time until they've got it done correctly. We do all the rest of the steps. When the person has got that step taught, we move on to teaching them the next one. Modeling is a basic skill. We sometimes call it demonstrating, but showing the person how it should be done. And we can do this in person, or we can use things like media programs that show people. Alternating, taking turns with people. They get to do the steps that are easiest, you do the steps that are toughest, and gradually you start to have them do the steps that are toughest. We can teach people using different ways of delivering instructions, like cues and prompts. Cues are not the same as prompt. A prompt is an instruction. It tells the person explicitly what to do. But cues only tell people that there is something to do. And so if we want a person to move away from being what we call prompt dependent, in other words, requiring us to tell them every step of the way, we start to use cues, asking them questions such as, what do we do now? Or is there another step? Those are examples of verbal cues. And we even can use gestural cues, like pointing at something or tapping a part of the body. When, for example, we're teaching somebody to shower, we might tap their arm instead of saying, wash your arm, or tap our own arm as a clue. Physical prompts, where we start the motion by taking the person's hand or body part, or hand over hand, which is a pretty intrusive approach, where literally we put our hands over the person's hands and actually teach them. This is usually done when we want to develop muscle memory for people, helping them to get the feeling of what it's like. It's usually an early step for people that haven't got any skills at all. And there's even self-help tools. People can buy books or online courses that navigate them through these resources and learnings on their own, at their own pace and in a way that fits for them. And again, we would look to combine all of these things. What we're going to do in this course and in the subsequent videos is dive into something we're going to call pervasive approaches. These approaches can be put into programs in many cases, but most of the time they're just the way we deal with people all of the time. And if we bring these approaches to people all of the time, we'll typically begin to see them improve in a dramatic and much faster way, and a much more solid way. So we're going to look at preventative techniques. We're going to learn a way of helping people to enhance their coping and communication skills. We're going to make sure that our approaches are most effective when talking to people. We're going to look at how we can adjust the environment of people. And we're going to look at how we can adjust people's activities, what activities are most likely to help them, and how we can lay out their schedule in a way that fits the needs of individual people. That concludes this video, and if there's anything here that I went through too quickly, then you want to make sure that you touch base with me to make sure you understand it clearly. You'll also find some of this information in the readings. In particular, you'll find it in our greenish-blue textbook and in the brown book, which is going to be assigned in this particular course.